I hope it's not too much of a controversial take to say that Scott Morrison was a pretty poor Prime Minister. However, I've been in major debates with my friends if he's actually the worst Prime Minister we've ever had. Until Morrison came to power, I had always assumed Tony Abbott was the worst Prime Minister, and I did not think Morrison could top that. So let's try and end this debate today as I put our previous Prime Minister in the spotlight. Now just a reminder before we begin that this video is brought to you by my lovely patrons Thomas Johnson, James Rapp, Mike Ran, Cameron Strauss, Tom Smarty, Jezza, Willow, Noah Morgan, Newcomer Echolocation, and special mentions to ARW and Edward PF for their contribution to today's video. For as little as $3 a month, you can get your name shouted out at the start of every Sorman video, as well as access to bonus behind the scenes content, link in the description below. Scott John Morrison was born in 1968 Waverley, Sydney. Morrison took on multiple roles during his formative years, including being a child actor in a handful of small roles. However, his biggest role would be the Managing Director for Tourism Australia. This role would somewhat define his nature as an incompetent manager with his approval of the "So where the bloody hell are you" advertising campaign. Not only was this ad mocked by satirists and even politicians around the globe, it coincided with a drop in tourism from the countries where it was screened in. Alongside this poor advertising campaign, Morrison was reported to have shown little respect to his colleagues, as well as ignore government procedural guidelines. The result of all this would be Morrison's early termination from the job. With his career off to a poor start, Morrison would move to enter politics in 2007, aiming to win pre-selection for the seat of Cook. Morrison would come a distant third with only 8 votes. However, late allegations that the ballot winner, Michael Tock, had engaged in branch stacking would see a second pre-selection ballot, which Morrison would go on to win. This pre-selection ballot would end up staining Morrison's reputation, with not only the revelation that Tock was innocent, but also accusations that Morrison had engaged in racial vilification of Tock's Lebanese background. Morrison would end up comfortably winning Cook. His relation to racial vilification would rear its ugly head again when in 2011 he urged the Liberal Party to appeal to the public perception of Muslims' inability to integrate to gain votes. Just as a reminder, Morrison's seat of Cook contains the beach suburb of Cronulla, which only 6 years earlier experienced one of the largest racial riots in Australian history between white Anglo-Australians and Lebanese immigrants. Despite Morrison's questionable comments on racial matters, he would be made Minister for Immigration and Border Protection following Tony Abbott's win in 2013. In this job, Morrison would be in charge of Abbott's Operation Sovereign Borders, in which the Australian Defence Force would aggressively target asylum seekers trying to get into Australia by boat. Personally reading up on this, I found Morrison's attitude to the whole operation quite dismissive of the plight of asylum seekers, and this is backed up by Australia's Human Rights Commission reporting that Morrison failed to act in the best interests of children in immigration detention. Leaving the immigration portfolio at the end of 2014, Morrison would somewhat try to clean up his image in the social service and later treasurer portfolios. Despite his attempts to clean up his image, he would make an absolute fool out of himself in 2017 when he brought a lump of coal as a prop to attack environmentalists in the Greens and Labour. He'd also fight hard to prevent a banking royal commission, which would later expose huge amounts of misconduct in the banking sector, playing into the negative stereotype of Liberals protecting the crimes of the rich. Despite his senior position in the party, few expected Morrison to become Prime Minister. To me, Morrison was someone who always benefited from having someone above him to cozy up to for support, and thus would not work well as Prime Minister due to having nobody above him for support. However, following Turnbull's resignation, he would throw his hat in the ring for the top job. I distinctly remember the 2008 leadership challenge. As a progressive, I was terrified of the prospects of Peter Dutton becoming Prime Minister, and when Julie Bishop was knocked out in the first round, I always remember praying that Morrison would win. With the eventual announcement that Morrison had won, I remember having 2 thoughts. The first was a sense of relief that we had just avoided Dutton as a Prime Minister, and the second was a surreal feeling as I'd already known Morrison as a random background member of the government, not a major key player. Does it feel weird that this guy was now our Prime Minister? Despite rearing his ascension to power, I don't particularly remember Morrison's time as Prime Minister. While 2018 that year marked the start of my All-Australian Elections series, I spent most of the lead up to the 2019 election focused on historic politics over current politics. I, like most other political commentators at the time, genuinely believed that we were in the twilight years of the coalition government, and thus we saw Morrison nothing more than a filler Prime Minister until Labour assumed office in that year's election. However, in one of the biggest upsets in Australian history, Labour would lose the unlosable election, and what was going to be less than a year of Morrison turned into 3 long gruelling years. I still remember being quite shocked at the results, as I, and still to this day, have no idea what Australia saw in the coalition. Maybe they thought Morrison was a decent bloke, or perhaps they just didn't trust Shorten as Prime Minister, but either way we were in for a rough ride. Morrison's first big screw-up would definitely be his response to the 2019 bushfire crisis, in which he'd be extremely dismissive of his responsibilities as Prime Minister. While I don't think he was wrong to be on holiday, his attempts to hide his whereabouts and refusal to return back to Australia are some of the most un-prime ministerial actions I've ever seen. This poor attitude to leadership would also persist through the 46th Parliament, with Morrison always being more focused on his public image rather than being an effective leader, hence his nickname Scotty for marketing. Despite Morrison's poor performance, he, like most other world leaders, would get a massive bump in the polls thanks to the COVID pandemic. Despite the actions of state governments being more responsible for keeping Australia's COVID cases down, Morrison would still gain a sizable amount of support, peaking at almost around 70% by mid-2020. While I can understand the large boost to his polls, what I could not understand is how Morrison was able to remain so popular for so long. Despite the controversies of the vaccine stroller and sexual assault allegations, Morrison would maintain a satisfactory rating well into 2021 and would remain preferred Prime Minister right up until Election Day in 2022. While one might point to polls being biased, I think we've just become so accustomed to the low standard of governance which had been on the decline since 2007. Morrison benefited from a perception that government wouldn't be any better under Labour, as well as the fact that he had remained Prime Minister for a whole 3-year term. Thus I think people just wanted some sense of stability in the role, which Morrison offered, even if he was a pretty poor Prime Minister. With Labour's win in 2020 resulting in a massive raising of government standards, I think the public is now much more aware of how bad the coalition government was in its final years, and this is in turn seeing their support fall to as low as 30% in some polls. This has also hurt Morrison's image, as voters normally have a bit of buyer's remorse after an election, with the previous Prime Minister often getting a small bump in the polls. Just look at how some people talk about Trump these days. However, the Liberals very much defied this trend, with them being less popular than ever, and likely heading for an even bigger defeat at the next election if things do not change in the next few years. Now let's go over to my Patreons. First we have my scriptwriter, ARW, who says, Scott Morrison in many ways embodied the worst elements of Australia's politics in the 2010s, and it's more poetic that he was the one who saw the lost decade out. Morrison first became prominent as a shadow immigration minister under Tony Abbott, in which his hardline stance on stopping unauthorised boat arrivals complemented Abbott's stop the boats rhetoric perfectly. When the coalition won government in 2013, Morrison succeeded his core KPI as immigration minister of stopping the boats, through his implementation of Operation Sovereign Borders in the face of intense criticism on human rights grounds. Morrison's evasiveness in press conferences and unprecedented centralisation of decision-making power in the hands of the minister, i.e. himself, during this period would set about his tone for the later performance as Prime Minister. Despite being more aligned with Abbott's brand of conservative politics, Morrison was able to safeguard his own political position amidst the infighting that erupted in 2015 to become Treasurer under Malcolm Turnbull, a position he served in without distinction until Turnbull himself was challenged by Peter Dutton in 2018. Morrison again proved tactful in allowing this infighting to play out before, presenting himself as the best way forward for the Liberal Party, defeating Dutton to become leader and Prime Minister in August 2018. Morrison, with his background in advertising, immediately presented himself as a leader in touch with everyday Australians, and conveyed through extensive use of visual medium of himself wearing baseball caps and often going to the footy. While initially dismissed as superficial and earning him the unflattering nickname Scotty from marketing, Morrison proved his doubters wrong by unexpectedly defeating Labour in the 2019 election. After a much criticised non-response to the bushfire emergency that ravaged Southeast Australia in the 2019 summer, Morrison was at the forefront of coordinating Australia's response to the COVID pandemic from March 2020, which consumed the rest of his prime ministership. With the vaccination program underway after initial delays, by the end of 2021, Morrison had hoped to use the goodwill he thought he had accumulated alongside the Australian community at the 2022 election. However, Morrison had not taken into account various factors working against the coalition's overall brand of politics that saw the Liberals lose a massive 17 seats. Most noteworthy was the loss of once safe Liberal seats in the wealthier urban areas to independent Teal candidates, putting the Liberals in its weakest position since the party's founding in 1944, especially considering most of those seats were held by former leaders of the party, including its founder Sir Robert Menzies. Many blamed Morrison himself for the result, although I am more opinionated this is more of a culmination of a long-term trend in the Liberal Party embracing reactionary politics to the point that its more educated constituency became increasingly alienated and began to organise their own political movements to challenge these elements. I was saying that the infighting during the Abbott and Turnbull years caused great internal damage to the party that Morrison was able to defy initially, but not for the long term. Where Morrison ultimately failed was proving to the Australian people that there was more to him than his PR-driven image. While the elements of the COVID response deserve credit, his inability to exercise centralised authority over the more concrete powers of state premiers meant many perceived him to have left the latter to do all the heavy lifting in their response. While Morrison was better communicated than a stammering Abbott and unconcise Turnbull, unlike those two, he presented very little in the way of ideological conviction, and he seemed uninterested in presenting any policies that would go beyond winning elections. The revelation that he had signed himself to a number of ministerial portfolios in a secret are also unforgivable abuse of constitutional authority that have no place in a democracy like Australia. I, like many others, do not rate Morrison highly, though whether history will mark him as a complete failure will depend on how long it takes for the Liberal Party to rebuild in opposition from the rock bottom position they are currently in following the 2022 election. We also have Edward Pierre, who says, "If there's one word I would use to describe Scott Morrison, it would be incompetent. His entire time in office can best be remembered by his failure to be a good leader during an era where leadership was arguably more important than ever. His absence during the nation's 2019 bushfires is arguably one of his most defining acts, and has set the precedent for what would be expected for the next few years. Other highlights include his botched handling of the COVID vaccine rollout, Australia's fallout with the Solomon Islands, and the whole submarine scenario, and failing to meaningfully act on climate change. Even 9 months after his government was defeated, we are still learning about new scandals in the coalition government, most notable which was Morrison appointing himself to 5 other ministerial portfolios unknowabouts to even his own party." Now, I got a lot of comments for this video on YouTube and I cannot read them all, so I've gone with 3 that I found interesting. Daniel Hedger says, "One word to describe our 30th Prime Minister shall be self-absorbed. Scott Morrison didn't do much in terms of social economic reform, something that could have been achieved due to him having longer in power than Abbott or Turnbull. He didn't care much about ordinary Australians, but I think I'll go further than most and say he didn't give a stuff about no one but himself. The way the Black Summer crisis was handled was totally unforgivable, and there was no support for anyone who had lost everything. All we could do was to dish out a handshake or two. There are too many screw-ups that his government caused to list here. Overall, I'd regard ScoMo as one of our worst Prime Ministers." We also have Look T, who says, "Scott Morrison was indisputably the worst coalition leader in decades. I genuinely lean towards the coalition and would usually vote for them, but I couldn't find myself voting for ScoMo. It felt like all the negative stereotypes of a coalition leader in one big bundle, and he made it impossible to like him. Even in 2019, while I wouldn't have voted for Shorten, I couldn't have brought myself to vote for Morrison. When the nation burnt, he was off in Hawaii getting a sunburn. While the pandemic broke out, he undertook no action and left it to the states, and then had the audacity to take the credit. He failed to get the vaccines, which left nearly all of Australia under total lockdown for months on end. He had no real response to the cost of living crisis in the Solomon Chinese military base, and destroyed Menzies Blue Ribbon Belt. In short, Morrison was the worst Prime Minister since McMahon by a landslide, and provided no real good for the country." And for a contrarian take, we also have David Hullingham, who says, "This is a rather unpopular permission, but I don't think Morrison deserves nearly as much hate as he receives. He definitely didn't do himself many favours, but he successfully got through COVID and secured the AUKUS deal. The controversy around his Hawaii trip was simply a case of wrong place, wrong time, and he returned as soon as the bushfires began to become increasingly severe. Not the worst PM, but not superb." So let's bring this video full circle and go back to my question of whether Morrison or Abbott was our worst Prime Minister. And I think after this video, I can confidently say that it's Morrison. Sure, Abbott's destruction of Labour's policies in 2013 set us up for a decade of lost progress, but at least he was a leader with a vision. With Morrison, you have all of Abbott's worst traits combined with someone who fundamentally wasn't fit to be leader. Abbott would face up to the media with his poor policies. Morrison would instead lie and deflect 24/7, and it's quite frankly disgusting. Also, on a personal level, reading up on Abbott's history, you get the sense that he was a man of strong Christian faith who just wanted to do the right thing in his eyes. Meanwhile, reading up on Morrison, you get the sense of a slimy man who lies and cheats his way up the ladder of success. A while ago, I asked my patrons this question, and I want to read out this reply that Darathinian gave me. Some things come to mind are Abbott's tearing up and gutting of a few Labour's more progressive policies immediately upon coming into office. That was bad at the time and a costly disaster in retrospect. Repealing the world's leading carbon tax, burying the mining tax, and botching the NBN rollout, cust Arena and the NDIS, mincing the tax code for corporations and religious pro-successor, Abbott at least was very public about it and you knew his agenda at what he was doing. I consider Morrison worse between the two as any issue Abbott started, like reckless spending and poor decorum, Morrison amplified and added to. He constantly overrode the democratic process, shirked responsibility across multiple crises, and was the worst economic manager even in terms of debt taken on to GDP growth. And on that note, we've come to the end of our series. With Anthony Albanese still in the role as Prime Minister, I won't be putting him in the spotlight. However, with his 1 year anniversary quickly approaching, I might possibly do a 1 year review with Aussies elect, so feel free to leave your comments here and you might possibly see them featured in a later video down the track.